So, glad to be here. It's going to be a fun talk. It's controversial, right? But nonetheless, there's some interesting subject matter that has come about recently with regards to new scientific information, and I kind of want to cover that. How many here are not familiar at all with the Shroud of Turin? Oh, a couple people. Nice. How many know a little bit about the Shroud? Nice. How about somebody that knows a lot that wants to come up and take my place? So from the start, I just want to say I'm not an expert in all things Shroud, but certainly having looked at the in-depth information that's out there recently and trying to compile some thoughts, I'm getting closer. But there's so much out there, and it's going to be impossible for me to cover that. So what I'm going to try and do is cover information that I find intriguing, interesting, and I hope you will too. There may be subjects about the Shroud that I'd missed, that I don't cover at all, that you're very interested in, and I'm happy to talk to you about that. But again, just totally impossible to cover all the information that's out there. So a few months back, John asks, which he frequently does, hey, do you want to give a talk in the summertime? Have you been looking at any topics that you might want to discuss? And at the time, I had been looking at epigenetics. I'm in medicine, and so that was kind of in my wheelhouse. And John goes, nope, I got somebody way smarter than you coming to talk about that, so you need to pick a different topic. So I had seen a couple of interesting studies on the Shroud, and so I thought, hey, what the heck? We haven't talked about that in at least not the recent past. So what if I reviewed that? And he said, okay, yeah, that sounds good. So, but truly, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. The Shroud is the single most studied artifact in human history. Thousands of books have been written, tens of thousands of articles have been written about the Shroud. Now, I've done quite a few presentations in my past. I'm an educator in medicine, so I give presentations for academic purposes. I've given a few science apologetics talks over my time, but I have to admit that this preparation for this talk was probably the most difficult that I've ever done. There is seemingly unlimited numbers of studies, opinion pieces, podcasts, YouTube videos related to the Shroud out there, and it's going to be impossible, once again, for me to cover all that, but I hope to cover the stuff that I find interesting, and I hope you do too. As you'll come to see, the Shroud of Turin is either the burial cloth of a crucified man, which some believe to be Christ, or the most extraordinary artistic forgery ever. As you might imagine, it's very controversial. Why so controversial? Well, if it's the actual burial cloth of Christ with evidence potentially for resurrection, think of the implications. Oh, I want to back up. So this is the Shroud, and we're going to talk about some basic facts, but you know, it's a relatively light, it's a linen cloth about 14 feet long and about 3.5 feet wide. And it bears the image of blurry, a dim image of a man. And these, stand by, these are burn marks, which we'll talk about, and everybody wants to focus on that. But here's the image, very blurry, right? You can't, there's the head, right? This is the front of the man. Here are the arms, appear to be blood marks down on the feet. Here's the back of the man, right? Back of his arms, buttocks, he's naked, and his legs, right? So I just wanted to point that out because sometimes I throw that up there, and if you haven't looked at the Shroud before, it's hard to sort of make out the image that's on the Shroud. So before I get started, a little terminology. You're going to hear me on a lot of my slides, it'll say TS, and you can see TS, that's the Shroud. Turin Shroud is what TS stands for. So sometimes I just use the word Shroud, sometimes I'll say TS, Turin Shroud. So there's a term to describe the study of the Turin Shroud. It's called syndenology. The word synden, Greek word for linen cloth, used in the scripture to describe the burial cloth of Christ. And the Shroud is made of linen. A person who studies the shroud is called a syndenologist, and interestingly, in Italy, there's actually a diploma program in syndenology. So much of what I'm going to focus on in this talk is the science, some of the science surrounding the shroud. And some of it's a little complex, and I'm going to certainly try and break down some of that information. Science, by definition, is 100% objective, without bias and presuppositions, using the scientific method as its framework. But scientists, on the other hand, like everyone, are susceptible to presuppositions and bias. So bias can influence the research process and potentially lead to distorted or inaccurate results in science. And I've reviewed a lot of historical and scientific data on the shroud, as well editorial opinions, published by people. And I can say I've never researched a subject where an underlying bias is usually so clearly evident. A close second might be COVID. So when it comes to shroud research, in my opinion, some researchers overstate their case. And I see it on both sides, those that support the authenticity of the shroud and those that believe it's an artistic fraud. And here's a quote, which interestingly is from one of the organizers for the carbon-14 dating of the shroud, which we're going to cover. His name was Harry Grove. He made this statement, which sort of summarizes the bias that can potentially be present. He said this: "It's a well-known fact that scientists can produce whatever result they want. If you believe that passionately in something, you can steer the results." My goodness, we've all been guilty of that, right? So, interesting quote from a guy who's now going to study the shroud. And I love that cartoon, right? We won't be needing that sample. So nonetheless, science is a powerful tool, and it can provide or point us to the truth. After all, God gave us science. It allows us to explore his amazing creation. I would say, looking at shroud studies, opinions, all the publications out there, it's probably 4-to-1. 4-to-1, that 4 being for the shroud authenticity, 1 being against. So that's the sort of ratio that you see out there. Today, when I look at some of the science associated with the shroud, I'm going to try and stick to studies that are described as peer-reviewed, right? So publications that have been peer-reviewed tend to avoid, I'm going to try and avoid editorials or opinion pieces that tend to be less objective, in my opinion. Peer review involves experts in a given area of science who assess the methods, the results, and the conclusions of a research project in an attempt to identify potential flaws, biases, or inaccuracies. Peer review helps filter out poorly conducted or misleading research. Unfortunately, the majority of shroud research is not peer-reviewed. Most findings originate with what's described as the syndenology circle, right? So an independent peer review in that circle tends to be minimal. And the last little pessimistic comment before I'm going to actually take off into my talk that I want to make is that as the debate around the shroud rages on, and it likely will continue to do so, these days it seems there is an attempt to capture the attention of the masses, right? Research, media, and money are all so intertwined. Research and media recognition affects the flow of money. Books can be sold. Viewings on social media can increase, and therefore advertising. Paid lecture opportunities can be had. So at times, there can be a conflict of interest in my mind, unfortunately, and I think this has affected shroud research on both sides. So let's move on, right? Okay, so what do we know about the shroud? It's a linen cloth with a faint front and back image of a naked man with runes corresponding to those in biblical descriptions of the crucifixion of Christ. 14.5 feet long, 3.5 feet wide, woven in 3-to-1 herringbone weave. The earliest undisputed historical record of the shroud is in Liry, France in 1357. Extensive studies by scientists and researchers with debates surrounding its authenticity and the nature of the image have occurred. It was damaged in France in 1532. And those are those spots that you see. And there's patches. Actually, patches have been used to repair the shroud in those burned through areas. It's currently controlled by the Catholic Church and housed in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy. That's why it's called the Shroud of Turin. The Catholic Church does not officially recognize the shroud as a relic. A relic is something that they use a term for, they consider authentic. But it acknowledges its importance as a symbol, an icon, and allows for occasional viewings, but not very many. So clearly the shroud has profound religious, scientific, and historical, as well as cultural significance, and I listed some of those here. But ultimately it comes down to, who is the man on the shroud? Is it a miraculous miracle or a brilliant medieval creation? So this is what it would look like as far as the shroud and its representation of the burial of Christ. Christ being wrapped long way in a linen cloth. Here's some biblical references to the shroud that I think are worth us looking at. From Matthew, and Joseph, that's Joseph of Arimathea, took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen shroud. From Mark, and Joseph bought a linen shroud, and taking him down, wrapped him in the linen shroud and laid him in a tomb. And from Luke, Joseph, the same Joseph, asked for the body from the Romans. Then he took it down and wrapped it in a linen shroud and laid it in a tomb cut in stone. So again, Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Sanhedrin, described as a good and righteous man, in fact, a follower of Christ. And he was a rich man who was granted permission by the Romans to bury Christ in the Jewish tradition. From John 19, so they took the body of Jesus and bound it in a linen cloth with the spices as in the burial custom of the Jews. And then John 20, this is when John and Peter got to the tomb. It says this, then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. Peter was behind him, but he just blew right into the tomb. John stood outside, right? Typical of Peter. So he saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. We'll talk about that. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple, John, who had reached the tomb first, also went in. He saw and believed. So, in John's version, he uses a plural term for linens, right? He uses it plurally. And the identification of multiple cloths. And he mentions the face cloth, which is called the sudarium, which we'll talk about a little bit. Another relic, which is historically present and held by the Catholic Church. So in John 20, what did John see that made him believe? Remember at the very end it says he saw and believed. Did it have anything to do with the shroud? Theologians certainly speculate. So beyond the Bible, there are extra biblical references to the shroud, but I don't have time to cover those. John said I can't take that much time. So this is an interesting paper from 2020, recently, that I don't, again, have time to cover, but the title of it is, Are There Veiled References to the Shroud of Turin in the New Testament? So the speculation of many, as you might imagine, in those times Christians were being persecuted. So if there was a shroud that bared the image of Christ, they probably wouldn't be advertising it. They'd probably be hiding it, right? So, and there are some interesting historical writings which seem to support this idea. Now, I think we have to be careful, especially when looking at scriptures. Sometimes we can stretch interpretations a bit. I've done this, likely, don't like to admit it, but in an attempt to support our own perspective, so we have to be careful of that. So this is the undisputed historical summary of the shroud, okay? Undisputed. Certainly in early times, we don't have the most complete records, but this would be it. So first recorded appearance of the shroud was in Liry, France, 1349. And then we mentioned the fire in 1532 that damaged the shroud. And then in 1578, the shroud was transferred to Turin, Italy, and a chapel was built in 1694 to house the shroud. Ownership was actually transferred to the Vatican in as late as 1983. So there are historical documents that are debated by historians that suggest that the shroud, and it would have to be, if it was authentic, it would have to be present prior to 1349. And there are some documents debated heavily by historians that seem to support that notion. So again, a huge historical debate, and I'll review a little bit more about that as we proceed in the presentation. So the picture that changed everything. The image of the shroud is faint, as we looked at, a brownish discoloration on the linen, and not immediately obvious with the naked eye. It's described as sort of blurry, and apparently it's most easily visualized if you're at least 8 feet away from it. In 1988, photography was in its infancy. A photographer named Secondo Pio was given the opportunity to take the very first picture of the Shroud of Turin. And this is what it looked like, right? So here's the shroud, and here's this picture. Secondo Pio. Music behind that one. So what he discovered astonished the entire world. It turned out that Pia's negative image, which is that, had positive quality details. So you remember how we used to get camera film developed, right? Roll it up, take it to Walgreens, right? Those, if you look at the negatives, those are negative images, right? And they take that and they make a positive image. Well, it turned out when Pia took a picture, it appeared that the shroud had negative image characteristics in and of itself. And when he looked at the negative, it had positive qualities, as if the shroud was acting as a negative. So when he discovered this, again, it astonished everybody, and this led to renewed speculation about the shroud's history and its potential authenticity. No one's ever seen that when they've taken pictures before. And again, photography was early. Secondo Pia's images spurred the controversy, with some claiming it provided evidence that the shroud was authentic, and others claimed that Pia made errors in his photographic technique, and some even suggested that Pia was perpetuating a fraud. Vindication for Pia came in 1953 when the shroud was again photographed using more advanced photographic techniques. The photos demonstrated what? The same findings as Pia's. The shroud appeared to be a photo negative, and the images were even more dramatic. And here's a full body image of the shroud, where you can see almost three-dimensional characteristics as opposed to the shroud's faint image without photography. So once photos became available with that photopositive quality, researchers could really start to look at what was really on the shroud. The details of that faint image became more clear. What was revealed, again, astonished everyone. The depiction of a man tormented, beaten, scourged, and crucified. So let's start with the scourging marks on the shroud. So a little warning. Not only the images, but reflecting on what is depicted is a bit disturbing, right? But it's important for us as Christians to maybe reflect upon that. But in reality, it's Christ's sacrifice, so I think it's important to look at it. So scourge marks. They're highlighted in red on this rendition of the shroud. That's not native, but they just marked, when they took a closer look at the shroud, where scourge marks were. They're on the back, the chest, the arms, legs, front and back, the buttocks. There's over 100 scourge marks, consistent with the Roman flagrum, which is that torture strap that they use, which had 2 to 3 straps, and each was tipped with a dumbbell-shaped metal or bone structure. Now, this is disputed, but seems to be more supported than not. Interesting how a forger could have done that. But if you look at the actual details of the scourge marks, it looks like that's the type of instrument that caused them. There's paired marks consistent with 2 scourgers, right? 2 people, not just one. Kind of the angulation of the scourge marks. Blood is present on the scourge marks, consistent with pre-mortem bleeding. So pre-mortem, that means this happened before he died. And we can look at the blood characteristics to determine that. Next, what about the head wounds? Wounds around the scalp, forehead, and occipital region. Blood is present on those wounds. Blood flows vertically, consistent with vertical positioning on the cross. Wounds consistent with thorns, with a thorn cap or helmet. And this is what they speculate. Actually, in Roman times, you know, yeah, a lot of times you see it on TV, he's got this crown of thorns, because that's the way they described it. But in Roman times, they used kind of a helmet or a cap of thorns. And the wounds seem to be consistent with that. Next, what about the crucifixion nails? So wrist wounds, not palms. There's wounds through the wrist, consistent with the Roman crucifixion. There's no thumbs visible. I know on this image, which isn't a great one, I showed this to my wife. She goes, well, there's a thumb. No, that's a crease in the shroud, but there's no thumbs visible on this image. Foot wounds. Some suggest the use of one nail, others two. This is disputed. Oh, no thumbs visible. And that's consistent with a median nerve injury, which I'll discuss. Blood present at the foot and wrist wounds. So there's actual human blood on the cloth at those wound sites. So interesting reference point, again, regarding the wrist wounds. The majority of medieval art depicted the crucifixion in the time that this shroud was first discovered or described. The majority of medieval art describes or shows Christ with what? Nails going through his palms, right? Studies with, they actually did this. They hung up cadavers, right? Crucified them, hung up cadavers. And they showed if you got nails through your hands, it just tears right through. Because if you look at this, it would be through this part and it just slides right through. The bones of the hand would just slip right through. So a nail has to be placed in order to support the body in crucifixion, has to be placed through this, you've heard of the carpal tunnel, right? So in that wrist area, there's a multitude of bones that provide a whole lot more strength to support the body during crucifixion. Another interesting fact, again, the nail through that carpal tunnel, when people get carpal tunnel, right, their hand gets a little numb, they wake up and it's asleep. So that's because your median nerve is being compressed. Your median nerve allows what's called abduction of your thumb. If you injure that median nerve, can't abduct. So it's adducts. So that's what the image would look like, right? No thumbs visible. Interesting fact. So the right side wound, large wound on the right side of the chest. Again, blood is identified on that wound. And my wife goes, wait, that's on the left, right? But think about the way the image was formed, right? So I'm the person being imaged on the shroud. The shroud's actually laying over my front, a right-sided wound, right? Now we're going to turn the shroud up and look at it that way, and it'll show up on the left. So it's kind of hard to follow, but so in addition to the blood, there is clear components which are consistent with plasma or serous fluid. Plasma or serous fluid, which could represent post-mortem blood, or the clear fluid from what's called a pleural effusion or a pericardial effusion. Some in medicine know what that is. It's an accumulation of fluid around the heart or the lungs that is not uncommonly seen in trauma. So if you remember John 1934, I didn't even quote it before, but I'll read it to you now. One of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately there came out blood and water. That would be consistent if there's pleural or pericardial fluid in addition to the blood. Facial injuries. Swelling, right cheekbone and eyebrow, nose, possible fracture, cartilage fracture, appears displaced. Swelling of the lips and chin, consistent with the gospel accounts of being struck in the face. These are all disputed. What is undisputed, though, is the images on the shroud are consistent with the biblical account of Christ's crucifixion. That doesn't mean it's authentic. It's just undisputed in that way. So, moving on. In 1975, scientists did an interesting study. They fed a photo of the shroud into what was called a VP8 analyzer. Now, the VP8 analyzer was like a NASA thing where they would take images of planets and you could see three-dimensional characteristics of the planet. So we've got a lot more sophisticated 3D analyzers now, but that was what was used back then. So this is what they saw. The findings showed that the shroud encoded 3D spatial information. This is not typical of any known artistic technique, especially in those times. Here's what the study authors concluded. The shroud image contains unique spatial information not found in ordinary images. The characteristics of the image are not explainable by traditional photography or artistic methods. Today, with even more sophisticated 3D analysis techniques, the shroud has revealed some even more interesting findings. So on the left, that's a 3D mapping of the shroud and even brings out more what the image under the shroud may have looked like. And then they've gone as far as to do that 3D printing thing, right? And that's what the body would have looked like under the shroud. Kind of bent over a little bit. There's speculation, was there a pillow under his head or was there rigor mortis? The unexpected 3D characteristics of the shroud sparked significant scientific interest. And aware of that interest, the Vatican, which had previously been reluctant to allow scientific analysis of the shroud, apparently reconsidered. The Vatican agreed and allowed scientific analysis with some rules and guardrails. They just didn't want anybody coming in there. So what happened was in 1978, 33 scientists, mostly Americans, spent 120 hours, continuous hours, conducting examinations of the shroud. And they timed it perfectly. Like there was a group that were sleeping, well, another group was up studying. So they took advantage of every minute that they could during that examination of the shroud. And the purpose was to determine the scientific properties of the image on the cloth and what might have caused it. So that was their entire purpose. What caused the image on the shroud? The 33 scientists, these are their specialties: infrared, microphotography, photomicroscopy, scientific photography, forensics, image analysis, X-ray radiography, X-ray fluorescence, chemistry, archaeology, physics, biochemistry. You get the point. Lots of different sciences with scientists with lots of different expertise. So from the STURP study, 39 scientific publications, peer-reviewed scientific publications, were produced. Following these studies, the STURP team actually released its final report in 1981, and these are the findings. I'm going to go through it. The image is not painted. No evidence of pigments, dyes, or binders, substances used in paint, was found on the image areas. Microscopic, spectroscopic, and chemical tests all indicated that the image was not painted or stained. We can conclude, in quotes, that now that the shroud image is that of a real human form with accurately rendered anatomic details of a scourged, crucified man. It is not the product of an artist. STURP finding number 2, the image is very superficial. The image is confined to the outermost fibers of the linen, only microns thick. It does not penetrate into the inner fibers of the thread, which you would expect with other artistic renditions, right? If you use paint, dyes, it's going to spread beyond the superficial fibers. This image formation is still unexplained and cannot be duplicated by known methods. Human blood. There is human blood. Tests confirm the presence of blood stains. Type AB. I was told by my wife, mention this fact. It turns out type AB is very rare. Generally, 5% of the population. In Middle Eastern descent, much more common. Interesting fact. So, type AB blood, hemoglobin was also seen, albumin, bilirubin, all components of blood. Serum halos surrounding subblood stains, remember on that chest where I described a potential, it's called a halo effect, where there is serous fluid as well as blood, indicate real biological fluid separation. STURP finding number 4, the image contains three-dimensional information. When digitally processed with imaging tools, the image showed realistic three-dimensional depth, which ordinary photographs, paintings, particularly in the 1300s, do not exhibit. Image intensity corresponds to the distance from the body to the cloth, implying some kind of spatial transfer mechanism. STURP finding number 5, they saw the fire damage and they saw the attempts to put out the fire with water. Okay, that was one of their findings, number 5. STURP finding number 6, no evidence of image under the blood. So the image of the man appears beneath the blood stain, suggesting that the blood was on the cloth before the image formed. Wrap your head around that. So if there's someone wrapped in a cloth and then blood contacts that cloth, and so there's blood, and then somehow an image is transferred to the cloth, the image is not under the blood on the cloth. It's only on the outside. This is one of the most fascinating findings from the STURP study, and it's difficult, or it makes it challenging to imagine how or why a medieval artist or forger could accomplish such a thing. Put blood down and then put an image down on top of the blood. Difficult to, especially in the 13th, 14th century. I was impressed with that. You guys don't seem to be very impressed with that. Okay, STURP finding number 7. Image formation remains a mystery. Ruled out conventional image making techniques, painting, scorching, chemical staining. Theories include oxidation, dehydration of the cellulose fibers, that's in the linen, but unknown mechanisms have been postulated. Some form of radiation or energy burst has been postulated. Natural chemical reactions between a corpse and the linen. This is not widely supported. There's no known way that this could have happened to show that image. And then there's a low relief, or what's called a bas relief, image modeling, which a forger could use to maybe drape over a statue to create the image. But again, it doesn't explain all the unique characteristics of the shroud. STURP finding, final conclusions. No pigments, paints, dyes, or stains have been found on the fibrils that make up the image. The image is an ongoing mystery, and until it can be duplicated, the cause of the image remains unknown. STURP did not conclude the shroud was authentic, but it ruled out any known methods of artistic forgery. So remember, what was the purpose of the STURP project? It was to determine what might have created the image. They failed, right? They couldn't figure it out. Their final statements. We can conclude for now that the shroud image is that of a real human form of a scourged, crucified man. It is not the product of an artist. The blood stains are composed of hemoglobin and also give a positive test for serum albumin. The image is an ongoing mystery, and until further chemical studies are made, the problem remains unsolved. So the STURP findings created excitement and intrigue, right? Could this really be the burial cloth of Christ with evidence of a resurrection? And then in 2022, 2024, I just find this funny. This guy who actually did a documentary on the shroud, he put out this $1 million challenge. And he said, if you can create an image using 13th century known available products to make an image like that, if you can create an image that represents the shroud with these characteristics, I'll give you $1 million. No one's ever done it. So there are some, and this is an interesting study, there are some theories as to how the image got on the shroud involving that energy transfer, if you will, radiation or light. This study attached a superficial image. It was able to produce a superficial image like the shroud. Here's what the author said. We achieved a superficial shroud-like coloration in a narrow range of irradiation parameters. They go on to say the total UV radiation power required to color a linen surface corresponding to the human body is 2.7 times 10 to the 11th watts. Cannot be delivered by any UV laser built to date, and certainly not present in the 13th century. So they said, we can do it with radiation. We can actually, but just on these little streaks of cloth. How would you do that for the entire shroud at the same time? One of the theories, again, proposed by sort of shroud advocates, if you will, relates to this idea of radiation energy accounting for the shroud image. It's called the vertical radiation theory. And certainly it matches the superficiality, directionality, and 3D coding of the image. It explains the lack of pigment or brush marks. It aligns with a potential this is why the shroud people like it, right? It aligns with a sort of instantaneous event, potentially the resurrection. It's theorized, and unverified physics are used to support it, which makes it scientifically speculative, albeit intriguing. So for shroud authenticists, this is a potential evidence for what? The resurrection. And what's the resurrection? Really important to Christians, right? So, Corinthians, and if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. For if only in this life we have hope in Christ, we should be pitied more than anyone. So you can see why Christians would love to see the shroud proved authentic. So following the STURP study, the Catholic Church decided to allow carbon-14 dating because it was only, the shroud was historically present, the only undisputed time was in the 13th century. But if it's 2,000 years old and authentic, how do we figure that out? So in the 80s, carbon-14 dating was a relatively new dating method, but pretty accepted as a valid technique. So the idea was, let's see if the shroud is really 2,000 years old. Carbon-14 dating is used to determine the age of organic materials, that is, materials that had been alive in the past. The shroud is made of linen, which comes from the flax plant, so it's organic, so it can be carbon-14 tested. All living things absorb carbon from the atmosphere. We're sort of in balance with the atmosphere, including carbon-14. When an organism dies or stops absorbing carbon-14, when it's dead, carbon-14 begins to decay. It loses what's called a beta particle, and it converts to nitrogen-14. So when it does that at a predictable rate, as you can see by this graph up here. So measuring how much carbon-14 remains in a sample allows for an estimation of how long it's been since the organism died. Or the linen got cut, right? The flax plant got cut. So in 1988, the shroud was carbon dated by 3 laboratories in Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona. And you can see where they took the sample for the shroud. Carbon-14 dating, right there, right? And here's how it was separated. Arizona, Zurich, Oxford. Arizona sample was initially too small, so they gave them a little more. The Reyes sample was already taken off the shroud in 1973 for other testing, not carbon-14. And this is sort of a reserve piece that's still available and still looked at in other shroud studies. In 1989, here's the conclusion after the shroud study. The results of radiocarbon measurements at Arizona, Oxford, and Zurich yielded a calibrated calendar age range of at least 95% confidence for the linen shroud of Turin of 1260 to 1390. These results therefore provide conclusive evidence that the linen of the Shroud of Turin is medieval. So, according to carbon-14 dating, the shroud was 700 years old. It wasn't 2,000 years old, roughly corresponding with the time in historical records that we first see the shroud. So this was earth-shattering to shroud authenticists, right? Those that thought that the shroud was a fraud, well, they said, see, I told you so. So there was, and still is, much criticism on the carbon-14 dating protocols and the data interpretations. We're going to go through some of that, but it included claims of bias. I'm not going to get and go into that direction at all, because there's no peer review on bias, as far as I know. So the carbon-14 dating, here's the criticisms: lack of transparency. The protocol lacked adequate peer oversight. Only carbon-14 daters were involved initially. They were going to have all the STURP scientists give recommendations on how the protocol would occur. They removed the STURP scientists, and only these 3 institutions were involved. There were no blinded samples. Blinded samples are imperative to assure authenticity, or to prevent confirmation bias. There were none. Contamination potential. There was a lot of criticism about how the shroud was handled, whether it was exposed to heat or smoke, like back in the early fire. But most of those concerns have been studied and mostly refuted. And then there's the sampling location. The sample came from that corner that I showed you that may have been rewoven during medieval times to repair the shroud. So to just give a little recognition to reasonable faith, right? William Lane Craig, what did he have to say about the shroud? Well, he wrote this book back in 1981, but more recently, this is from a podcast in 2021, and this is what Craig said. In 1981, in my book, The Sun Rises, I argued that the Shroud of Turin was probably authentic. Then I had the rug pulled beneath me by the carbon-14 testing done. that seemed to show that it was medieval. Until the tests are redone, I don't think we should appeal to the shroud as evidence. It is still too controversial. So that was back in 2021, and I think it reflected a lot of sentiment from the general populace, including Christians. Well, looks like a carbon-14 said it's only 700 years old. If it's not 2,000 years old, can't be authentic, right? That was the sentiment. Now, again, that was in 2021. There's a lot more that's come out on the shroud. I'm interested in Craig's views moving forward. Maybe we'll get them. We'll see. So, since the carbon-14 dating results were released, shroud researchers have proposed, like I said, a multitude of reasons as to why the carbon-14 was flawed. The one theory, which I think may have some legitimate scientific support, is the proposition that the radiocarbon sample area from that corner of the shroud, may have been from a medieval repair. This was an early study which promoted further investigations into that. Basically, the study used IR spectroscopy to examine the chemical makeup of the fibers from various areas of the shroud, comparing them to the carbon-14 sample site. And here's what the authors said: the patterns are all distinguishably different from one another, clearly indicating differences in their chemical composition. In particular, the radiocarbon samples are not representative of the non-image samples that comprise the bulk of the cloth. So, IR analysis seemed to indicate that the carbon-14 sample site was chemically different than the rest of the shroud. Then this study, although it's not peer-reviewed, so I want to make that statement, but it is referred to by a lot of peer-reviewed studies, so I'm going to throw it out there. These researchers examined the actual textiles, the threads, the linen threads, and they reported irregularities, including seams and inconsistent fiber characteristics between the carbon-14 sample site compared to the rest of the shroud. Here's what they said. It is well known and documented that the shroud has been repaired several times in its history, including in the area from which the carbon-14 sample was taken. The theory that the shroud has literally been patched with medieval material from the 16th century in the carbon-14 sample itself explains the medieval carbon dating results. Makes sense, right? If it was repaired in that area, maybe with 15th, 13th, 14th, 15th century material, then of course it would carbon-14 test to 700 years old. So in history, certainly we know that the shroud was viewed in public or in private. A lot of religious leaders and kings, apparently historically, would have had access to the shroud. It's a 14-foot long thing, right? If you're going to show it, where are you going to grab it to unfold it? Those corners. What happens to linen when you grab it repeatedly and stretch it? It can start to unravel. We know historically that the shroud has been repaired on multiple occasions, not just that burn area and patched at that burn area, but during other times, but they didn't tell us where they did the repairs. It just said repairs were done. Okay, so we have documentation of that. Then came Ray Rogers. I think this is a fascinating study. Ray Rogers was actually a chemist, and he was a part of that STURP team in 1978. He set out to refute this idea. He said there's no difference between that corner and the rest of the shroud. So his intention was to refute that idea, and he called them, they're the lunatic fringe, right? So his findings surprised even himself. He found cotton fibers, dyes, and what appeared to be spliced threads in the carbon-14 sample material that weren't present in the rest of the shroud. Here's what he reported in his peer-reviewed, published study. Combined evidence from chemical kinetics, analytical chemistry, cotton content, and mass spectrometry proves that the material from the radiocarbon area is significantly different from that of the main cloth. The radiocarbon sample was thus not part of the original cloth and is invalid for determining the age of the shroud. So his findings again suggested that carbon-14 sample site was potentially a medieval repair reweave, is what they call it. Another study, 2012, they looked at UV fluorescence. I'm going to start moving a little faster because John's going to start giving me a dirty look. So they looked at UV fluorescence of images that were taken of the shroud. And here's what one of the authors of this study, again, peer-reviewed, published. There is a statistically significant difference between the 4 radiocarbon data samples and the sample area of the shroud with representative ultraviolet fluorescence. This analysis demonstrates the anomalous nature of the radiocarbon data sample area. And you can see here, and I tried to, there's a lot of very complex and sophisticated images that come out of this and graphs. But just to show you, a simpleton like me, I can see this color, which corresponds to the sample site. This is that Reyes site that was taken out, so there's nothing there. This is where they took the carbon-14 sample site. This is the main shroud. See how the fluorescence is different? So could it be that that's different material than the main body of the shroud? That's what he's proposing. Again, another study, 2019. Kind of did the same thing, but used a different approach. Photos taken by Miller employed different illumination approach than that of the UV photos from Morgan's study. Applying Morgan's approach to these color photos, it was contour plots, suggests that the radiocarbon region or may indeed be anomalous, and it needs to be further studied. And you can see it again here. This is a different way of analyzing the image on the shroud, but you can certainly, even to the naked eye, see that. And they do all kinds of contour plots with that information. So now, a little history regarding carbon-14 dating in 1988. After the publication that the shroud was 700 years old, researchers asked for the actual raw data, like from Zurich, from Arizona, from Oxford. The British Museum, which oversaw the study, wouldn't release it. They said, nope, we're not giving you that, which is very unusual. Studies, especially published in Nature, and if you're proud of your science and you stand behind it, show us the data, right? So why didn't they release it? I'm not going to speculate, but I can assure you others do and have. So it took legal action in 2017, almost 30 years later, for under a UK Freedom of Information Act, just like we have in America, for the British Museum to be forced to release that data. Once the data was released, other researchers were able to take a look at that raw data and see how they did the study. And this was a study published just 2 years later in 2019. Again, peer-reviewed. The raw data strongly suggests that homogeneity, that means consistency of the data, of the aging, is lacking. It's not very consistent. Lacking in the data, and that the procedure should be reconsidered. Based on statistical results, we question the level of confidence of 95% attributed to the AD 1260 to 390 calendar age range. And then this study, a year later, again, analyzing the raw data. Analysis of the raw data shows that the hypothesis of a constant amount of carbon-14 among the dated subsamples is rejected. The evidence, the heterogeneity of the raw data, meaning the inconsistency of the raw data. Also, the consistent ages of the control samples. So they had control samples. Unfortunately, they weren't blinded, but those showed consistent carbon-14 data. When they knew how old it was, it showed consistent results. But when they looked at the shroud sample, it was inconsistent. That's heterogeneity. So it appears that the conclusion, quoting from the 1989 study, the results provide conclusive evidence that the linen of the Shroud of Turin is medieval, needs to be reconsidered. Alternative dating methods. This is really what prompted me to, I saw a couple of studies on this and I was like, oh, that sounds intriguing. I knew a little bit about the Shroud. It might be worth, reviewing some for the crowd. And John was like, okay, well, had no idea what I was getting myself into, right? So this is the idea. Linen is made of an alternative dating. So we have carbon-14. That's really the only way we've dated that shroud at this point. And it's an accepted approach. Linen's made from the flax plant. Flax fibers are made of cellulose. These crystalline cellulose fibers gradually degrade with age, and molecular chains become increasingly disordered, and it's called amorphous, and you can see them right up here. So when they age, they become more amorphic. So aged linen, young linen. old linen, young linen, if you follow. So if we have samples of linen of known age, and even from radiocarbon dating, you can compare them to the samples from the shroud and therefore potentially estimate an age of the linen on the shroud. This is the new alternative dating technique that's come about. So this study, which was published in 2015, looked at that linen based on the information that I just provided. And they compared it to 13 other known linen samples of known age, ranging from BC 3250, that's old, right, to AD 2000, so more contemporary. And they used that for calibration. So they tested the mechanical characteristics and the spectroscopic absorption. So what that means is how it reflects light on the samples, and demonstrated changes with age. So a simplistic way to think about it, as linen fibers age, they lose their strength, right? They'll break easier, right? And that kind of makes sense. And you can measure that. You can compare known fibers of known age to shroud fibers. In the same way, as linen fibers age, the absorption of light changes. And think about an old sheet that's been washed 1,000 times. You hold it up, you can kind of see right through that thing, right? Because it's aged so much. So that's it's much more complex than that. But for me, that's a better way to look at it. So this is what they found in their testing. Infrared spectroscopy, they found that the age range of the shroud dated to 300 BC, so 300 years BC, but plus or minus 400 years. Looking at, this is laser spectroscopy, 200 BC, plus or minus 500 years. And then mechanical analysis, tensile strength, the torsion effects, all the things that you can study of linen fibers. They found 480 plus or minus 400 years. This, actually people criticize this because you can't take 3 different age measurements and then take a mean, but they did it just to make the point, right? So their mean date was 33 BC plus or minus 250 years. And they also mocked the 1989 study by saying, and we're 95% confident, because that's what they said about the carbon-14 dating. So this is another study, and this is the one that actually prompted my interest. Again, based on cellulose degradation, that amorphous property in cellulose, they looked at X-ray scattering of the linen fibers. And they got what's called signal peak intensity patterns, and that's this thing right here. This is where the area that they're measuring, signal peak intensity patterns. So on the slide, here's what they said. So we applied a new method for dating ancient linen threads by inspecting their structural degradation by means of wide-angle X-ray scattering called WAXIS. Results are compatible with the hypothesis that the shroud is a 2,000-year-old relic. This is what they did. So they knew they did actually 9 samples in this study. Here's 4 of known age, 2000 AD, 575 AD, 65 AD, and 3250 BC. And then there's the shroud, okay? So the shroud's this yellow line. If you look at it, it's the closest to this green line. That's the shroud in its peak absorption. And the green line is 65 AD. So that's how they came up with that data. Do you follow that? I don't. No, just kidding. Lots of criticism about this study. With this method, dating accuracy depends critically on unverified conditions of the shroud for centuries. So if you store a shroud in a climate-controlled environment, it's not going to get that degradation as quickly. But if it's not in a climate-controlled environment, it would, right? So there's a lot of variables. That's a part of the criticism of this as well. It still needs broad independent replication and peer review. This is a peer-reviewed study, but it needs more testing. The beauty of this type of testing is it doesn't destroy the fibers. You can test them over and over again. Carbon-14 destroys the fibers. That's why the church is like, you keep destroying part of our cloth. We don't want to give you any more. Okay, some other interesting ways to look at the potential authenticity of the shroud. Pollen. Pollen gets stuck down into small crevices in linen. And if pollen is identified on the shroud in high enough quantities, which correspond to a plant which lives in a particular geographic area, the implication is that the shroud had, at some point in its history, been in that geographic area. This study identified on the shroud pollen. And what they did is they actually looked at historical records that correspond to certain pollens that would have been present in oils and ointments that were used in the burial rituals of first century Jews. So, I'll get to that, but here's what they found. Here's their results. The most abundant pollen on the relic may be attributed to genus, I'm not going to try and pronounce that. Ancient historic records give us references that could link the pollen traces to a mixture of balms and ointments employed for preparing the body for funeral and burial. The study reveals a coherency with these historical records of the rituals. So here's what they're talking about. Remember Joseph of Arimathea? It describes him and Nicodemus. He bought the shroud. Nicodemus actually brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about what, 75 pounds. Taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it with the spices and strips of linen. This was in accordance with Jewish burial tradition. So those authors were implying we can look back at historical records. We know how Jews did this. These pollens on the shroud correspond with that. Interesting finding. Another pollen study published, again, in a peer-reviewed journal, 2015, they made this statement. These three plants have their geographic distribution in the Near East that is indicative of a Palestinian origin of the Turin shroud. So they found three pollens that have their origin in the Near East, especially near the Middle East, right? So they go on to say, and this is interesting, the pollen is contaminated by aluminum silica subparticles, iron-rich subparticles of gypsum, and salt. These three minerals are commonly found in the particles of the soils of arid and desertic zones. So essentially they're saying there's dirt on the shroud that corresponds to what we'd expect in the Middle East. Additional studies and publications are out there regarding pollen on the shroud, but again, many are not published in peer-reviewed scientific journals, so I'm not going to cover them. Speaking of dirt, that has been studied, published in peer-reviewed journals. This study looked at dust or soil, particularly found on the shroud on the knees, the feet, and the face of the shroud image. Here's a summary of their findings. Limestone particles were identified on the feet of the Turin shroud image, matching rock-cut tomb limestone in Jerusalem. They go on to say close microchemical similarities between the shroud dust and Jerusalem soil via high-resolution testing was confirmed. That's this thing right here. So findings suggest that the shroud may have had contact, or at least been contaminated by soil around the Middle East. These findings have been criticized for multiple reasons, including, and I think this is a reasonable criticism, there's known to be limestone in Europe, Italy, and France. They didn't compare it to the limestone known to be Italy and France. So I think that's a reasonable criticism. We also looked at DNA of both plants and humans on the shroud. Regarding plant DNA, this is what the authors found. The large variety is compatible with, again, peer-reviewed published study, highly diverse geographic ranges. Some species have a center of origin and have diversified in areas around Mediterranean basin, including North Africa and the Middle East. So plant DNA on the shroud. Findings are compatible with the scenario that the linen cloth was exposed to different locations across the Mediterranean area. Like with the pollen studies, the implications being if DNA from plants are present on the shroud from the Mediterranean area, either the shroud was contaminated by those pollens at some point in its history, or it was there at some point in its history. John's stirring around back there, which means I need to speed it up. So we also looked at the DNA of humans on the shroud. Many individuals have left traces of their DNA on the shroud, likely belonging to different ethnic groups. This is what the author said. And from faraway places, geographic regions including Europe, North and East Africa, and the Middle East. And again, this is human DNA. These sequences could fit well with the geographic path of the postulated long journey from the Near East. So like plant DNA, human DNA represented on the shroud could also correspond to its history, its geographic history. Or it could just suggest contamination from diverse sources. People from all over the world at the time came to visit the shroud. So it was just contaminated. Somebody touched the shroud from that ethnic origin. Interesting sidebar about this study and speculation on the author's parts, but 40% of the human DNA came from India. Right down here. So, what's the deal with that? Well, according, and this is their speculation, according to historical documents in the 1st century, linen came from India. By the 13th century, time it was first seen, linen was being made all over Europe. But in early times, it came from India. And there were well-established trading routes between India and the Middle East during that 1st century. So, speculation. Could the linen shroud purchased by Joseph of Arimathea come from India? Well, that's where it all came from back in the 1st century. Interesting. And 40% of the DNA on the shroud is from the Indian subcontinent. Other interesting points, and I'm going to rush through these. There's some people that look at Byzantine coins. That's the Eastern Roman Empire. This is after Christianity was accepted by Rome. They look at minted Byzantine coins, and some researchers indicate that there are similarities between those coins and the shroud image that reflect the fact that, or they speculate the fact that, therefore, these coins were minted based on reference to the image on the shroud. And again, I'm not going to go through these, but this one was minted in 692 AD, and there's some markings on it that are consistent with what some people say is the shroud image, and on these bronze coins as well. And these were minted in the 700s. I'm not going to go through that in great detail. And then there's the Hungarian Prey Codex. This Prey Codex is dated to 1192 AD, not disputed. The art shows the body of Jesus being prepared for burial, which seems to have many features that would imply reference to the shroud, implying that the shroud was present during prior to the 14th centuries, right? Because this is 1192. So if they were using the shroud to reference this art, then then that proves that the shroud was there before the carbon dating. My computer, come back to me. Oh boy. Come on now. There we go. Okay. Jesus is shown naked, appears to be being wrapped in a shroud, consistent with the way the Shroud of Turin wrapped the body. His arms are crossed at the wrists, fingers are long, and there are no visible thumbs. There's also a clear mark on his forehead and in the hair resembling the blood marks on the shroud. Cloth shown in the image has geometric weave similarities to the Shroud of Turin, that 3-to-1 herringbone weave. And there's an L-shaped pattern of holes on this Prey Codex, right here, that corresponds to an L-shaped pattern of holes on the Shroud of Turin. That's pretty interesting. So there are additional points of similarity between these Prey Codex and the Shroud of Turin, but here's a study published in 2021 in a peer-reviewed journal that basically looked at all the historical accounts and reports analyzing the Prey Codex and potentially its association with the Shroud of Turin. The authors say this: the main reason for this interest appears to be a discussion on the degree of confidence attached to the results of the 1988 radiocarbon dating of the Shroud of Turin, AD 1260 to 1390, with 95% confidence. These characteristics on the Prey Codex, in addition to its origin, make it impossible to claim that the Shroud of Turin did not influence this illumination. It can be said with confidence that the artist of the Prey Codex probably had a direct or indirect link to the Shroud of Turin. So, stand by. There is no dispute that the Prey Codex is dated to 1392. So, if it was using the shroud as reference in its creation, that would assume that the shroud was present before the carbon dating. How are we doing? I get paid to put people to sleep, and I can do it in many ways. I can't bill for this though. Okay. Moving on. So the two, and I'm going to rush through this. Sorry I'm keeping you so long. And actually I'm going to blame it on John here in a second. So the two big issues regarding the Turin shroud are the carbon-14 dating, right? We covered that. Because there's a lot of other stuff, the STURP study, that seemed to be like, whoa, could this be a real thing? But then there's the history. Why are there no historical references to the shroud between the 1st and the 13th century? Now, there's some debated documents that some people say are a reference to the shroud, but let's look at that question just a little bit. And we're going to look at the image of Odessa. Like the shroud, the image of Odessa is one of the most mysterious relics in Christian history. So, and it's recorded and documented in the history. But here's what we know about the shroud. Revered icon of Christ, believed to be a miraculous imprint of his face on a cloth. It's also called the Mendelian, which is a Greek word for small cloth or towel. Tradition holds that Jesus created the image by pressing his face on the cloth. And it's described in historical documents as not made by human hands. So, the image of Odessa, could it be the shroud? Let's look at that. So the history of the image of Odessa is certainly somewhat unclear, but its origin traces back to the 1st century. We know that. Odessa is now part of modern-day Turkey. But here's multiple early accounts, or legends, I think is sometimes a better phrase, surrounding the image of Odessa include different versions of how the image was created and its geographic history. But this is what we know. Originally, it was linked to King Abgar of Edessa in the 1st century, and according to ancient texts, it apparently cured his leprosy. This Syrian scholar directly referenced the image of Odessa, and again described it as not being made by hands and a divine portrait, and apparently was used to rebel a Persian attack of Odessa. In 944 AD, the medallion or image of Odessa was transferred to Constantinople. And then the medallion disappeared from historical history in 1204 AD. So, I'm going to review this really quick. There was a sermon given to commemorate the return of the image of Odessa to Constantinople. There's a sermon that's documented by an archbishop named Gregory, and this is what he said. This reflection has been imprinted only by the sweat from the face of Jesus, falling like drops of blood, and by the finger of God. For these are the beauties that have made up the true imprint of Christ. Since after the drops fell, it was embellished by drops from his own side. Blood, both are highly instructive. Blood and water there on his side, sweat and image here. So some people think this refers to the fact that this image of Odessa, which was being celebrated, is actually more than just the face, that there's a component of his side. And this is a picture dated to arguably before certainly before the carbon-14 dating, and it shows the Emperor of Constantinople receiving the image of Odessa. This is the image of Odessa, but it's long. So some people argue that art form reflects the notion that the image of Odessa was actually a longer piece. There was a 4th century crusader who was actually a chronicler that referenced in 1203. This church in Constantinople, he said this, displays the burial cloth of the Lord, which is stood upright every Friday so that the figure of our Lord can be clearly seen. That was in 1203. Most people think that references the shroud. And then the Acts of Thaddeus. This was in the 6th century, again referencing King Abgar. The image in this Acts of Thaddeus, this image of Odessa, is described as sindan, which is linen, and usually describes the burial cloth of Christ. And it's also called a tetradiplon, which means doubled in 4. This prompted a shroud researcher named Ian Wilson to sort of go, okay, tetradiplon, what does that mean? Doubled in 4. And here's what he did. He doubled the shroud, a replica of the shroud, 4 times, right? So, first fold, second doubling, third doubling, 4th doubling. Looks a lot like the image of Odessa. And this is dated to 944. So he speculated that the image of Odessa was actually the shroud folded in 4. If you look at early replicas of the Shroud of Edessa, very much a rectangle in shape, and what appear to have a sleeve or a slip around them, revealing just this facial image of Christ, of the body, of the face on the shroud. Here are some dated to replicas dated again before the carbon-14 dating, and here's when they're dated, but all before the carbon-14 dating. Some other interesting points. Some researchers speculate that there are features on the replicas of the image of Edessa that correspond to the shroud. I'm not going to go through those because I don't have time. And there's also a study out there that looks at sort of what appears to be photographic evidence or analysis of the shroud that indicates that there's like what they call a halo around the shroud face image. And it's speculated that if the Shroud of Turin was the image of Edessa in a sleeve with just a circular opening, certainly that was exposed to light more frequently, so this halo effect could occur over time. There's also studies that look at fold marks that seem to be consistent with how a shroud might be folded. They looked at the creases in the textiles, and again, supporting the idea that maybe the shroud was folded, doubled in 4, and therefore was the image of Edessa. So if the Shroud of Turin was the medallion or the image of Edessa doubled in 4, this would be its historical route, right? From Jerusalem to Edessa, the image of Edessa there, then got to Constantinople where there's lots of references of what appear to be the shroud and that picture, and then it got to Liry, France after the Fourth Crusade. Interestingly, where were most of the Crusaders from in the Fourth Crusade? France. Where does it show up? France. I don't know, that's speculation on my part. So I'm not going to go over this too much. This is the head cloth that many people feel was wrapped around Jesus' head at the time of his burial, which corresponds to not only the John account in the Gospels, but also Jewish tradition as to how Jews were buried in that time. And here's just a brief summary of what some studies have purported to be similarities between there's no image on the head cloth. It's speculated that was removed before Jesus was put into the shroud because that's what the Jews wanted to do. They didn't want any blood spilled, and they wanted to honor the person by covering their face, especially if there was trauma. That's known to be the Jewish tradition. Here's sort of confirming notions that link the sudarium of Oviedo to the shroud. Blood group, AB. Bloodstain patterns, matching. Facial measurement matches, at least by the studies that have been done. Chemical residues, similar. Pollen and dust origins, similar. There's a lot more out there on the sudarium. Go take a look if you're interested. So, I'd be done. Right now, I'd be done. But the president of this chapter sent me an article 1 week before I'm giving this lecture. You know how long I spent putting this lecture together? So he sends me an article. I can point him out with my laser back there in the back. So he sends me this article 1 week before, and it doesn't, no comment, just here's an article. I'm kind of obliged to cover it. So I apologize that I'm going to take the time to do this. It is a study related to the shroud. And so here's what it was published. Okay, this is July 28th, 2025. The number of shroud studies that come out and the critiques of them are extraordinary. And this, just in that 2-week period of time, has gotten so much media bluster, it's incredible. So the shroud is an unruly animal in and of itself, as far as the media is concerned. But here's what this study looked at. So from peer-reviewed, findings suggest that the shroud's image is more consistent with an artistic low-relief representation than with the direct imprint of a real human body, supporting hypothesis of its origin as a medieval work of art. Okay, what does he mean? Remember I said low relief. This is not uncommon, called low relief art. It's almost three-dimensional, but it's flat, right? So this is what the study looked at. And this is not uncommon in medieval times, right? This low relief art, also called bas relief. So this is what the study did. It took a three-dimensional human statue, if you will, and then it did a low relief statue. And then it ran computer simulations and saw what the cloth looked like at the contact points between laying it over this three-dimensional image, this full body statue, versus the low relief. And again, they didn't actually do it, they just did 3D modeling, showing that the resulting contact image with low relief model was more consistent with the shroud image. The author said this: the low relief sculpture model produces a contact pattern more closely matching the shroud. The study does not propose a specific image transfer. He's just taking a computer and going, okay, so if I put it over, this is what the image would be like if it touched the shroud. But he didn't propose how the image got from the statue to the shroud. He didn't look at heat, pigment, or any other sort of transfer, which really seems to be an important question given his conclusions. And it didn't take, so here's the criticisms that came out really quick afterwards. Does not account for the complexity of the shroud image. Photographic positive quality, encoding of 3D spatial characteristics, superficial image that is only the top microfibers of the shroud, no account for the blood under the image. So it really didn't take long for the shroud researchers to critique this study, and with the criticism being expressed almost every day, I've found stuff. So I told John when I first looked at this study that I didn't think it was going to add anything to the conversation. He didn't respond. So I had to go a little further. This is a professor who is a critic of the shroud, does not believe it's in its authenticity, and he's considered a leading expert on the shroud. He wrote this book, The Shroud of Turin, and he said this about that low relief study. He said, for at least 4 centuries, we have known that the body image of the shroud is comparable to an orthogonal projection onto a plane, which certainly could not have been created through contact from a three-dimensional body. He's meaning we knew that a low relief statue could, was comparable with that. But he goes on to say this study certainly did not uncover anything that we did not already know. So it's one of those studies that gets a lot of stir, but it really doesn't uncover anything that we knew. So just to finish up, there's a couple of recent review articles looking at the entirety of the shroud data, the entirety of shroud opinion, and they're published in peer-reviewed journals. So I just want to cover a couple of statements from 2 of these recent reviews of the shroud and its science. This one, published in Theology and Science, said this: the study systematically evaluates the 2 leading hypotheses, the medieval creation of the shroud and its authenticity as the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth. And then they go on to say, Bayesian analysis challenged the dismissal of the shroud's authenticity. This examination suggests a warrant for the proponent's belief in the authenticity hypothesis. And this one was just published a few months ago, back in February, 2025. If the shroud is indeed the work of an artist, it is remarkable that even to this day, no other fabric exhibiting similar characteristics has ever been discovered. Artistic attempts to replicate the shroud, none have fully succeeded reproducing all of the shroud's unique properties. The evidence from the significant reports published to date, which challenge the radiocarbon dating, is insufficient to overturn its findings. Nonetheless, given the numerous concerns and disputes surrounding the 1989 radiocarbon dating results, conducting a second series of radiocarbon tests to redate the shroud is considered a logical and necessary step. So review articles seem to still say, we don't know. Based on what has been out there, it's reasonable to still consider authenticity, but there's some data to suggest not. So as I mentioned, when I've looked at the shroud, I found it actually nice to look at both sides. This is a guy, he's actually a science teacher, but he's a prolific writer. Hugh Ferry is his name. He's got this the medieval shroud website. He looks at the literature and writes the counter arguments, and he does it pretty well. And he's pretty prolific about it. So if you want to see the other side, that's a reference. So the Shroud of Turin, spiritual significance. I think this is the most important part of the talk. Unfortunately, I only got 1 slide to cover it, right? So Pope John Paul II said this about the shroud. The shroud is a mirror of the gospel and a reason for deep reflection. Is the Shroud of Turin the burial cloth of Christ, or is it a medieval piece of artwork? That, in my opinion, remains an unanswered question. But no matter what, it's powerful. It mandates reflection on the passion of Christ. It's a visual demonstration of what Jesus went through: scourging, blows to the face, a crown of thorns, the nails of crucifixion, and a spear piercing his side. The pain, the suffering, all a testament to God's immense love for humanity and the sacrifice made by Jesus. To me, that's the big picture.
Excellent job. Somebody should speak to the president. Pressure him about you to speak more often. So y'all think about doing that today? So we do have a little bit of time for Q&A. Jose, if you would switch the slides, if you would go back to the to my slides, my announcements. That way, the contact details for that Aurora chasing trip will go back up there. All right. So Q&A. 2 rules for Q&A real quick. First rule, ask a question. Okay, so I have a microphone, Amy has a microphone. If you have a question, raise your hand. We will bring the microphone to you. Okay, and when you have the microphone, please ask a question. If you need to set up your question with a little bit of commentary, then that's fine, but don't be that person that goes on and on and on and on and on. That even during every month when I say that, there's still some person, and everybody else is thinking, that's the person. Okay? Don't be that person. Ask a question. Other people are going to want to ask a question, so please be respectful. Second rule, I'm the president. I get to ask the first question. Okay? So, my question is twofold, 2 parts. So, of all the evidence, what do you feel is the strongest to you personally for authenticity? And then counter to that, what do you think is the best argument for it being a medieval forgery?
So, first off, the first part of your question, the most significant piece of evidence that would support its authenticity, to be honest, I think it's a compilation of all the information, some of which I've presented here, that sort of builds up or buttresses the notion that, we don't know what this is. Could it be authentic based on some studies? Pollen, dirt, blood, the way the image is created, its 3-dimensional qualities. I really can't point to one thing where I would say, this absolutely turns the corner for me and would point me in a direction where I would say it's more likely authentic than not. It's a compilation of that information. With regards to what piece of evidence sort of points to medieval art, the uncertain. There's 2, and I already pointed them out. The uncertainty about the age, which we haven't. The carbon-14 dating, the initial results. I think if we could redate the which they're talking about, the church, as you know, the Catholic Church is not all that interested in creating more controversy, to be quite honest, but there's some hope. And then the lack of historical records indicating if the shroud was present, where was it from the 1st century to the 13th century? So those 2 points, those uncertainties, are what I would say point to, well, potentially it is from the 13th century and a medieval piece of artwork, because we don't have historical data and we don't have scientific data that supports the actual age being 2,000 years old. Yes?
Okay, I'm your wife, so I get the second question.
Oh my gosh.
Hi, everybody. It was awesome. Really good presentation. I wanted to ask, I may have missed it, but I don't think I did. Did they test the blood on the shroud, and do we know if that blood matches the blood of a Middle Eastern man in that region during the time of Christ? Also, do we know how old the man was who had the shroud on?
Okay, so the first part, testing of the blood. There's lots of DNA on the shroud, right? Remember I went through the DNA studies. So knowing, if you look at the blood samples themselves, interestingly, and this is part of God's creation, I did talk about the human body, evidence for design. Interesting, blood is of all the cell types in our body, there's more blood cells in our body than any other cell type. Interesting. But blood it actually loses its nucleus before it goes into your bloodstream to carry oxygen. So blood, RBCs, the red blood cells that carry the oxygen, don't have any DNA in them. There's other components of the blood that do have DNA in them that we can look at, but remember I mentioned type AB is more common in Middle Eastern people, but other than that, there's not any scientific data to say anything else about the person. And then with regards to his age, there's speculation just based on the image itself, and that he was a young to middle-aged person. That's all we know. Yes.
Thanks for this. Scripture tells us that they took 75 pounds of stuff. Why in your presentation was nothing mentioned of any of this stuff as residue on the cloth?
Good question. So there are some evidences of potential residue on the cloth, but the scientists say that that's an organic material that over time would quickly get decomposed, in the sense that bacteria get on these things, and ointments are preventative, but if it's truly, and we know it's 700 years old, if it's truly that age, scientists wouldn't expect residue from those ointments or balms. But they do have the pollen that gets stuck down in the...
Wouldn't it be the same for blood and serums?
You would think. Yeah, good question. Yes?
So I heard in another presentation on this that the pollen that they found, at least some of it, had that species when it stinks in about 300 or something that was actually verified.
Yeah, so again, some of those studies, and I believe I know which one you're talking about. I forget the guy's name. Anyway, some of those are in that syndenology circle and aren't necessarily peer-reviewed, published studies. So there's a lot of debate about it. So I tried to stick to the ones that were more, looked at and verified by other scientists. Like, okay, these are reasonable findings. Yeah.
Thank you.
You bet. Yes.
Great talk.
Thank you.
I think that I started out as a skeptic, and I think you've convinced me that it's probably older than medieval. I'm not sure that I've bridged the gap. What makes us think it was Jesus? The Romans crucified a lot of people. And if it was Jesus, and if it was in the possession of believers at the time, Paul mentions there are people still alive who witnessed Jesus. Why would not Paul also throw in, and we have a shroud, has a zidage on it?
Yeah. So the last part of that question, as I mentioned, there's some veiled references, and there's, again, an incredible amount of stuff out there, but there's some veiled references, almost cryptic, within early Christian literature that some people think imply that they do have the burial cloths of Christ. But again, they're being persecuted. They're not going to advertise it. And they would potentially even hide it. So that is the reason expressed for why they weren't talking about it. Now, the other part of your question with regards to medieval, sorry.
I said the Romans crucified a lot of
Oh, yes. So, yeah, actually, Roman crucifixion was outlawed apparently in about 300 AD. So, and there is no one else in history that we know of that was crucified with a crown of thorns on his head. So that's why people think that maybe it's Jesus, because you're right. Could it otherwise be another person that got crucified? For sure. And the other interesting thing is that when you look at it, in medieval times, in the 1300s, we didn't have the same internet or the same historical context of what a crucified body in Roman times might look like. So this is a big question for me, is if this is an artistic forgery, how do they know how the details of Roman crucifixion back in the 1st century would have taken place. We know a lot more now than we did way back in 700 years ago. So how did a forger come up with all these nuances of what now we know is the way Romans crucified people? There's another part to your question. Did I miss it? Okay. Yes.
Just to really quickly touch on that, I was struck by, you were talking about the totality of all these different things. It's not just the totality for me of all the seven, it's the fact that it's still 700 years old, so it had to be somebody back then who couldn't have remotely anticipated the kinds of analytical methods and science that we have available to us today.
Yes.
Would have had to put all these things together to be that convincing. So that leads to, a little more, lends it more possible credence. But my actual question was on the provenance that you touched on earlier in your presentation. The historical records really start to indicate in France in the 1500s, and then the fact that it was moved to Turin, I guess, in the late 1500s?
1600s, I think, yeah.
Well, anyway, but then the last note I think on this slide was that was officially transferred to the Catholic Church in whatever it was.
1983.
Right. So what group or entity actually officially owned it before it was transferred officially to the, I think it was the Vatican, is the specific.
Yeah, actually, I sort of misrepresented that because it's actually a proper, it is deemed property not of the Vatican, but of the Pope. The current Pope is always the owner of the shroud. That's the way it's designated. I just said Vatican because the Pope is kind of the Vatican. So it's actually the Vatican. Now, prior to its transfer to Turin, there were royalty in both France, people that owned castles, and there's documentation historically of them, having the shroud with them. This is after we knew it was present in France. So a lot of royalty and religious leaders were involved and owned the shroud. And there's a family, and I'm blocking on the name, but that family, again, royalty in that country, transferred it to at the time, the church in Liry, France, and then it was transferred to Turin. But so always under, because they were all Catholics, so it was always under the Catholic Church, but then got officially transferred to the Pope in 1983, and the Pope is legally the owner of the shroud. I want to go back to your original statement, which I think is very solid with regards to the multitude of data points that sort of reflect or make you think, how could an artistic forger create a shroud image? Not only the type of image, the depth on the fibers, but the blood on the, there's no image on the other side of the blood. So blood had to get there first. What about the DNA? What about the pollen? What about the dirt? I mean, all those things. So you got a forger. I got to get some dirt from Jerusalem. I got to get some pollen from this area, and sort of put that on the shroud, not knowing, like you said, what kind of tests we can do now. I mean, think of it. I read through the kind of testing they were doing, and I'm like, holy smokes, I didn't know we could do that. It's extraordinary, and to have it still questioned to this day and not know the answer to how that image was formed and how all these bits of information came to be as far as on the shroud, it's extraordinary. And that's what makes it fascinating to Christians and non-Christians.
Okay, so due to time constraints, we're going to make this the last question.
Okay.
Did you see Tucker Carlson's interview yesterday?
Oh, that's what I was.
It was released on non-X.
He didn't interview me? Yeah, right.
It's Jeremiah Johnston.
Oh, I know Jeremiah Johnson.
And just a 90-minute, they just lay it all out if you guys
Yeah.
want to watch it again.
Jeremiah is one of those guys, and he's got a lot of great insight about the shroud, and he's passionate that it is an authentic piece, right? And I love that about him. I'm not quite there yet as far as saying absolutely no question. But Jeremiah is one of those people that he's created a following in a big way with the way he can present that information and the material that he presents and the knowledge he has. So yeah, he's a good resource. You know, if you want to be convinced that the Shroud is authentic, Jeremiah can do it for sure. And how did Tucker do on it? Did okay?
Yeah, he has
Okay.
good questions, very methodical.
Nice. I'll have to watch that. Dang it, I should. Yesterday it came out. Oh.
Thank you, LD. Thank you very much.